This video essay will focus on Rafael Correa and his citizens' revolution in Ecuador. My name is Shane Kerr, this is for Dr. Jen Rinaldi, and the date is October 1st, 2017. Before we begin, we have to look at what populism is. According to Muller, populism is anti-establishment, anti-elitism, and anti-plurality. In Latin America, the populism model focuses on structuralist approach with economic policies. It is a political strategy for winning and exercising power. Using a populism model, leaders have the ability to reach those who regard themselves as having no voice in the political system. It is a commitment to social justice for excluded groups. Before we examine Correa and his presidency in Ecuador, we have to look at the Filipino government and the president of Rodrigo Duterte and his anti-drug campaign. This demonstrates how a leader could say what the people want to hear, but not live up to the promises once already in power. For example, Duterte promised to do whatever was necessary in order to crack down on the drug-related crimes in the Philippines. But within 1 year of winning presidency, there was already more than 7,000 people who died in drug-related extrajudicial killings. Just like Correa, the president of the Philippines promised to take care of all the poor people. Rafael Correa used a populist campaign in government to secure presidency within Ecuador. This included a strong and charismatic leadership with focuses on discourse, communication, propaganda, and the redistributive policies rooted in traditional populist mechanisms. Correa also confronted the status quo and remade the constitution, focusing on the deinstitutionalization and a reinstitutionalization. Correa had a regime change and its essential characteristics of all Latin American populism. The radical reinstitutionalization began with reforming a new constitution. The adoption of the 21st century socialist ideology also worked with his enactment of a global institutional strategy. Ecuador prior to Correa in power. There was an extreme political fragmentation and instability. From 1996 to the year 2007, there were 6 different governments that ruled, and none of the elected presidents could finish their term. Correa's radical populism put an end to this trend. Correa had a fresh representation of an old tradition, like Velasco. He used the communication strategies of the politics in the 21st century for moral reform and state-centered conception of governance. The birth and the consolidation of the Citizens' Revolution began in January 2007 and ended in September 2010. It transcended the capitalist Western lifestyle, with strong ethical overtones, which morally binded the opposing alleged corruption of the elites. Correa focused on 4 features within his radical populism model, the first being charisma, which was a top-down approach. In a top-down approach, this lacked the links to social movements and/or organized social groups. This was a movement created by the executive branch under Correa's power. The second being international and regional movements, the global movement in the 21st century socialism sphere. The Citizens' Revolution is very different from Chavez, who was the president of Venezuela, and Morales, who was the president of Bolivia. It is different as Ecuador is not as rich or dependent on oil revenues as Venezuela was. The Bolivian experience represents a political movement built from bottom up. Morales, who was the president of Bolivia, incorporated indigenous claims as an essential part of his political project, whereas Correa has systematically excluded any organic linkage with social and indigenous movements. The third, innovation. Correa's discourse and practices were similar to the populist features of recent neoliberal populist leaders. The only thing is that he differed them from by successfully building a new state and political regime. Fourth, refounding Ecuadorian society as a whole. It wasn't just a political project alone. The installation of the Constitutional Assembly in 2009 was the starting point for the rebirth of Ecuador as a country. Correa focused on new legal frameworks that enacted 60 new laws approved in his first 3 years of presidency. This led to the radical redefinition of all existing institutions and norms in Ecuador. Correa's administration presented as an irreversible historical process. It wasn't just seen as any other presidency, but in fact a revolutionary moment. It involved a radical transformation of economic, social, and cultural realms of society. The drafting of a new constitution to create the basis of a new state was underway. The Assembly dissolved the Congress that had once been democratically elected in 1996, and also partially suspended the 1998 Constitution. As many benefits as there were to Correa and his model of populism, there were several implications, the first being his permanent campaign communication strategy. He used this to stay in power and press one of his main administrative opponents. For example, Correa saw independent journalists as political actors. He actually had a lawsuit against the El Universal, which was the biggest Ecuadorian newspaper in Ecuador. He dealt with illegal contracts favoring Correa's brother. In Correa's view, the privately owned media lacked the political legitimacy to inform society, so thus he sought to displace private media with newly established state-owned media under direct government control. Correa's media presence has successfully blocked the emergence of any opposition, or even any substantial criticism of the government's policies. Thus, the public opinion has been neutralized. Consequently, the presidential message has emerged as the only credible reference point for a majority of Ecuadorians. Since Correa took office, the political discourse in Ecuador has become completely centered around the president. No other political figure has even had the chance to open an alternative space. The limitations on free speech and Correa's direct subsidy transfers to the poor, involving housing bonuses, reduction in electricity bills, and etc., has created a sense of community, even though it is an incoherent social policy that does not successfully reverse structural social problems over time. Other implications include breaking traditional models of civil, political, and social rights, emphasizes collective rights of minorities, as well as the plural national character of the state over individual guarantees, which could be seen as civil rights. It weakens the influence of organized groups within each sector and focuses on the concentration of power in the hands of one person, the president. Government's legislative agenda has strongly been opposed by many organized groups in society. For example, indigenous movements, journalists, university students, mass media, public servants, etc. The predominance of the executive branch over civil society, political society, decentralized autonomous governments, and market actors reinforces the president as the only point of reference. This leads to the predominant position not only all levels of the state, but also above society and the market. Rule of law. Final thoughts. While populism has once been regarded as an offspring of democracy, with the common principle of benefiting the people, we can clearly see with the Correa government just how misconstrued populism can really be. While some leaders have effectively used populism to benefit their country and the majority of the people within that country, some leaders have used the ideology of populism to distort the people of their countries in order to not only stay in power, but to create what some would even argue a complete dictatorship. Once again, tying back to Correa and the Filipino president, we can see just how controversial a populism model could be. Bibliography of the sources I have used for this presentation include